What makes a watch matter? Not just mechanically, but culturally. That's the question at the heart of my conversation with Eric Wind, CEO of Wind Vintage, one of the most respected voices in the world of vintage watches. Eric takes us inside the hidden circuits of influence, how collectors shape brands, how stories become value, and how passion turns into power. We talk about authenticity, legitimacy, and why vintage collecting is one of the most powerful forces driving the modern watch world. Did you know that Christie's auctions went from 400 attendees to 10,000 attendees in only 7 years? This was a thrilling, unfiltered conversation about taste, trust, and time, and you'll feel that energy right from the start with Eric. Eric, thank you very much for accepting my invitation and for your support. You've supported and encouraged me to do this.
Anyone from Georgetown asks me to have me on their podcast, I say yes automatically.
Amazing. That's the power of networking here in America. Eric is, the whisperer of the vintage watch world, where people with influence ask him about watches, and then he whispers the market. And today, we wanted to talk about the previous topics that I've covered in my first series of watches and politics, mainly the return to the vintage trend, the neo-vintage trend, and also collectors as political actors. By the way, Eric went to Georgetown. He studied international relations, so a lot of intersections between watches and politics from his side as well. But Eric, just to start, I want to start with a very open-ended question, and that is, what do you see as the main intersections between watches and politics?
Yeah, very simple question, right? Well, I think it's always interesting to see what politicians are wearing. I wrote an article about the comprehensive guide to the watches of the American presidents on Hodinkee. That was quite a endeavor, going from Washington to now Trump. But it's interesting just to track what people wore over time, what was popular at the time, who was really into watches and who wasn't. Of course, all of those presidential watches are kind of keepsakes and highly valued today. We were able to sell, some when I was at Christie's, and I've had a few of the LBJ gift watches before. I have a cricket that might have been Richard Nixon's cricket from when he was vice president. Like, a lot of different interesting things that happen and transpire. But, that is interesting. And then when I was writing that article, seeing how watches could be like an issue at the time, like Gerald Ford had one of the first kind of electronic watches, digital watches, I should say, which was the Pulsar, where it had the red kind of LED lights. And that watch, I think, was over $2,000 in the 1970s. It was just after he had become president. Solid gold, 18 karat. And I believe, and everyone freaked out, including in the Washington Post. So he basically put it away and wasn't seen wearing it again. And then when Bill Clinton became president in 1993, he was wearing his Timex Ironman with his tuxedo for the inaugural balls. And the Washington Post columnist said how kind of gauche it was, like gauche or whatever, where it's like such a bad look. It was terrible. So it was funny to see people criticize for either having too expensive of watches or too cheap of watches and what they're doing. It
sounds exactly like Washington D.C., where you get criticized for whatever you do.
Yeah, exactly. And then George W. Bush wore a Timex kind of throughout his time, but a fellow Yale graduate owned Timex. Maybe he still does. I don't know. So it was like kind of a throwback to his Yale days. And it was obviously an inexpensive watch, so it was like he was trying not to get criticized for being patrician and too wealthy. Um, Whereas Dick Cheney had like the full gold Rolex Day-Date, which kind of reflected his time with Halliburton and going back all those years
Yeah.
to energy. So it was kind of just really, I always find it interesting what people choose to wear because it also is kind of somewhat reflective of who they are, who they're trying to be, what they value. When you get into international politics, you see, sometimes despots in the third world wearing insane watches. Like I think the leader of Cambodia often was wearing a Patek Philippe Sky Moon that was like over $2 million even 15 years ago.
Yep.
And you see just insane like leaders in Africa wearing Richard Mille $500,000 plus watches. Or there was a big controversy when the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church was wearing a breguet, but it was a very expensive, super complicated version. And I would think the retail was $500,000. Might have been a grand and petite sonnerie or something. Everyone went crazy at the time because why is the head of a church wearing that watch? So then they put out a photo where his wrist was photoshopped, but you could still see the reflection of the watch in the lacquer of the table. So it was before. This was like also 10 to 15 years ago. So it's really, really funny. Putin, since uh, since the Ukraine conflict, he's only been wearing a Russian-made watch. But before that, he was a big fan of Blancpain. And someone in a Russian factory had commented on his watch and like, how come you have such an expensive watch? And he took it off and gave it to him. I
Yep.
don't know if you ever
Yep.
saw that, the
Yeah,
Aqualung.
yeah, I saw that with this. Yeah.
Yeah, so you just see all these stories around watches, who's wearing what, how it affects kind of how they're perceived among the general public.
Thank you very much. And hey, what a good start to our conversation. What drew me into all this topic was the effects of politics that had in watches, and the effects of politics that had in the development of watches. I in my mind it was always like, hey, what would happen if John Calvin would not ban jewelry?
Yes,
Then
exactly.
we might not have um, Swiss watches as we know them today, and also
Correct. Yep.
so even at when I'm teaching my students, and I teach a lot of speech, and how words and have effect, and the actions, and how those shape the future of politics, and in this case the future of watches. So this is how I wanted to bring these things together.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So for people briefly at home that don't know, John Calvin was kind of the leading Protestant thinker. Was I want to say the 16th century, correct? And
Yeah,
yeah,
16th
15.
century.
Yeah, 1500s, and then he outlawed jewelry, and he was Calvinism kind of became the primary, if you will, Christian religion in Switzerland, and he basically forbade women from wearing jewelry, but said that watches were an okay instrument to have because it's about keeping time, and that was just kind of entering the market. So all of the jewelry makers kind of switched to making watches or ornamentation on watches in a sense in Switzerland, and that was really the birth of Swiss watchmaking.
But, yeah, and another, we can of course direct the listeners also to the first series of watches and
Yeah,
politics, where we explain all of this. But so the main idea is that according to Calvinism, when you present a watch to somebody, is not that you're presenting to that person. It's like presenting a present to God, and God
yeah,
sees everything. This is why even those parts that you don't see, they used to make them perfect, and this is what we know as Swiss watchmaking, and all those kind of things. So now, Eric, uh, we go fast forward to World War One, when wristwatches became a thing, and
yeah,
because of the necessity, and
yeah.
then the trends and globalization and everything. But what I wanted to ask you is, what drew you into vintage watches? because that is something that is appealing today, that we see a lot of brands going also to neo vintage styles. What about you personally? What drew you into that, and how do you define their return or their appeal today?
I love vintage watches, their design, their history. My first mechanical watch was a vintage watch. It was a Hamilton that was a gift from my grandmother to my grandfather for their wedding in 1947.
Oh,
It's kind of interesting. With watches, they're at such an interesting intersection of design, history, innovation, but also politics, economics, because Hamilton obviously is no longer an American company. It was like, kind of a sad state for American watchmaking until recently and trying to rebuild the idea of American watchmaking. But there's so many things you can't even articulate all that goes into a watch and the context of the time, the designers, technology, etc. So I feel like you feel that in a even more sense with the older watches because they're set at a time and place that's different to today. And I love the histories of interesting owners. I love the way that watches were made. Less industrial, more hand intervention when you look at case designs, dials, etc. They honestly they were better made in terms of the hand craftsmanship that went into it, but less perfect than today where everything's industrial and kind of perfect. And I feel like that hand intervention is like somewhat of the soul of the watch. Like it gives it character. Every watch is unique versus, whatever brand you're looking at today is trying to produce things absolutely identical. So you'll see thousands of watches made and zero difference between all of them. Whereas kind of every vintage watch you look at is different, whether it's because of how it's aged or how it was worn, etc.
why do you think the appeal today? What happened? It's a niche thing. I always liked vintage watches, but
Yeah.
for me, it was because I like to dress more classic. And the second thing, it was very emotional because of money. So, I found more affordable vintage watches at the beginning. But what about the recent interest? It's a niche interest. What was the major force shaping this interest?
I think at the end of the day, humans are storytellers. And
Mhm.
if you go back to probably the earliest men that walked the earth, they were telling stories about what they saw and what they did. And like you see that that's what ultimately survives from Greek literature. Like we love the stories of the Odyssey and other things, and like the storytellers historically through time. The Bible is essentially one big story as well. So particularly the Old Testament. So you've got um, the natural human reaction to tell stories, and watches are part of that. Like, oh, this is a Zenith El Primero. It was one of the first automatic chronographs, but basically Zenith and during the quartz crisis, the TV company and electronics company bought the watch company just to own the trademark, and then ordered the destruction of all the machines. But Charles Vermont or Vermeau basically didn't want to do that, the short little guy, so he hid all the machines and parts in the attic over time. And then thank God they had all those parts later when Ebel wanted to do an automatic chronograph in the 80s when watchmaking was kind of having a resurgence, and then Rolex later. So, that storytelling is so cool. Or like, hey, this is a Universal Genève tri-compact similar to what Harry Truman wore at the Potsdam conference or things like that. Like, these are stories you just can't, you know, you can't really explain. I had a Universal Genève I bought from an auction in Montana that was a pilot who transported Hermann Goering to the Nuremberg trials after he
Oh, wow.
basically had turned himself in and surrendered. So, like, that watch is so cool. It was this guy's watch who was a pilot in World War II. And he had, like, in his diary, talked about how he had to basically cram Goering into this plane, and he was in it as well, just the two of them. And, like, it crossed his head. What if Gehring tries to take me out or take the plane down? Like, am I going to take the plane down or what's going to happen, basically? And Gehring had a Universal Genève on himself, funnily enough. So it's just kind of insane, all the little stories that are so interesting.
Yeah, and I guess that's I'm guessing that is also the appeal of the people who are starting collecting, because people start collecting from normal watches that I guess their parents they're to commemorate something and then what they like and stuff, and then at the end of the day, well, what are you going to do? So you start
Yeah.
collecting stories.
Yep.
Now, Eric, you interact a lot with collectors. With you curate collections, and I just saw that you are doing something. Was it with one of the brands
J Press.
clothing?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It was fun.
Congratulations! I saw that. That's amazing. And
Yeah. It was fun.
when so that is actually very a political statement. They have the opportunity to work with big
Yeah.
brands,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
they're doing that. Can you
Yeah. It's
tell
so
us a
cool.
little bit about that, or if you cannot speak about that, maybe
No, no.
in general about those trends?
So my passion really is vintage watches, as you know, and like the reality is not the vintage watch industry doesn't have a lot of people speaking up for it because all the brands want you to buy new watches. So you have like a 25-30 billion dollar a year industry against like a very small community of people like myself, a small group of dealers and collectors and things. So my strategy over the last 10 years, really, I've been writing about vintage watches for 15 years since I began writing for Hodinkee in 2010. But um, always to try to promote vintage watches, obviously, and like my passion. So I always look for opportunities to, expand the interest in vintage watches. So I was really excited when Kith approached me a few years ago about putting vintage watches in their stores, one of the kind of hottest
Uh,
clothing brands and kind of streetwear approach. Sneakerheads love Kith. So it's not like it's a big money maker for me. It's more of a pain than anything, but it's good to have the watches in there, and like it's really good for vintage watches. Same when I'm working with like celebrity collectors, everything else. I think a lot of times people are looking for something that not everyone else has, and there's the
yep.
storytelling aspect.
Mhm.
So Nate Bargatze really liked this Cartier tank he got for me that was formerly owned by the guy who played Darth Vader, David Prowse. And that's like, and that was a gift from the King of Saudi Arabia to David Prowse.
Oh
So
wow.
it's like, you can't really make these stories up. They're too crazy. And
Yeah.
Prowse talks about it in his autobiography as well. But that's part of it, like the storytelling. But when it comes to like J Press, they could literally probably go to any brand new clothing company and like here's 30 reversos or whatever. But it was like a great opportunity to show a variety of vintage watches, different things with cool stories, match it with the clothes. Which the idea is that the people who buy these clothes, their hope and kind of general trend is not that you get the jacket and then you throw it away after 3 months or like give it away. It's the idea is that you have this jacket for like 10 years, or maybe longer. So that's kind of the appeal of vintage watches. They should last for hundreds of years if they're taken care of properly.
Yeah. 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 And how does this influence like the prices? How do collectors maybe influence the prices? How brands frame their history and their future? Because now we've seen some brands claiming to be the oldest brand, not these kind of things.
I mean, in a simple sense, it comes down to economics of supply versus demand. So, certain watches, there's super high demand and very little supply. Like the Cartier crash is kind of that way historically. It was never a mass made watch. Um, and they still only make like one a month, I think, for their London boutique. And they've done very select limited edition versions, but they've been able to keep supply very low, which keeps the demand high. Um, Universal Genève is kind of an interesting case study. Obviously, fantastic brand of watches. I'm on their advisory panel, recently purchased by Breitling, and being restarted and revitalized, but there wasn't as much demand like 4 years ago, and prices were had been on a decline for almost a decade, a slow decline after kind of an initial craze when Ben Clymer started talking about it, the founder of Hodinkee.
Mhm.
Then prices kind of shot up, and then they were just kind of on a gradual come down because there wasn't as much demand. But now that there's a lot of excitement around the demand, prices have shot back up again. So that's just kind of an interesting thing to see in real time. Gallet is kind of going through a similar thing because Breitling also purchased Gallet. So I'm always looking for both of those brands because they're relatively easy to sell right now. Um, Even with you and I are both passionate about vintage JLC, along with my colleague Charlie Dunn, but the fact they've done these collectibles launches has really inspired interest in the vintage watches. Obviously, they did a book with the first launch, and like the more scholarship that's out there, the more people are kind of excited about learning about these things, the higher the values go. So it was good for your collection because you have one of the craziest collections I've seen.
Thank you. Thank you. When I started, one of the first things that struck me was the parking, and it was so New
Yeah.
York in my
Yes.
mind because like everybody everybody that speaks about New York speaks about parking. So, that was something, and then it was a deep dive
Yeah, it's hilarious.
since there. But now also, as you said yourself, like brands have also started capitalizing on that heritage. Like Vacheron did another capsule of such watches, restored vintage watches, and
IWC is now doing it as well.
oh really?
Yeah, they
Oh,
just did 6 watches, similar approach.
no, that's news for me. I
Yeah.
didn't know that, and that's the
Yeah.
good thing about talking with Eric Wynn. Um, and how do you see collecting itself as a form of cultural or political capital, or do you see it as such or not?
Yeah, I mean, some people do it to try to impress other people. It's like the same thing with that. At the end of the day, I feel I'm not like a big modern art guy, but like a lot of modern art is just like sitting around at parties, like I got this artist is the next hot thing, and like that sort of stuff. That kind of infiltrated watches with all the hype watch stuff the last starting kind of 5 years ago with the Nautilus and everything else. That's really cooled off, obviously. Um, but a lot of people are buying mostly to show other people what they have, like find it like, oh, whatever. It's not even mostly for themselves, whereas I feel like real collectors are doing it for themselves and they're happy to share it with other people. But like the primary 95% of the reason they buy it is because they like it, not to like impress someone else. That they meet with in a business meeting or something else, because the odds are the person across the table won't even recognize what it is. Whereas when someone's buying like a Richard Mille or an Aquanaut or a Nautilus or things, generally they're just trying to impress other people. But yeah.
The worst thing is when somebody recognizes one of the vintage watches, is that they can never stop talking about
Yes.
it. So it's their problem now, not
Yeah,
mine.
exactly. That's good.
So now, and we've seen a lot of things happen in auctions and museums. So how have you seen auctions, museums, exhibitions to shape that cultural narrative around watches? And with your background in auctions, maybe you can tell us something about that.
Yeah, so it's pretty a very concrete term to tell you about just the growth in interest in watches. So when I was at Christie's starting out around 2015, a decade ago, it was not unusual for an auction to have like you might have 300 to 400 lots in the auction, and you might only have 400 people registered with Christie's to bid, either in person on the phone or online for that given auction. That includes dealers, museums, brands like Patek Philippe, and collectors. So then fast forward to today. I think 2 years ago, Christie's Geneva had over 10,000 people registered. for their Geneva auction. So in 7 or 8 years, he went from 400 to 10,000. That's incredible growth. And yeah, that's a huge 2,500% increase in the amount of people that you have to kind of prove that you're capable of paying for these bigger lots. Like you have to have a bank letter or things like that. So
Mhm.
these aren't just bozos kind of registering online. Like these are people that are serious. Um, so, in any event, that shows you the growth. Obviously, there are a lot of modern watches and auctions, independents, things like that. But, vintage is maybe half of a given auction at least still. So that shows you just like there's been huge growth and interest.
And when you started with, did you anticipate such a trend or growth or?
I always have believed in vintage watches, obviously, and like the growth in the market and people wanting to pursue it. But ultimately, it's my passion. And like, as I've said, I think a few times in different things, like, even if no one else really cares about them, that's almost better because I can get things less expensively. But I think there's going to be a group of collectors that are collecting these things until they die, even if they become unfashionable, myself included.
Hey, guilty as charged here as well.
Exactly, you too.
So, and what role do collectors as individuals play in legitimizing the growth or the elevation of certain brands or references? Is that do auctions, dealers play a bigger role, or like the collectors, in your opinion?
It's all linked because if collectors are interested in them, then dealers are interested because they want to buy and resell, and auction houses are interested because they can get excitement and kind of clout. So it's all linked. Like one of those, I think, interesting areas, which you have one of the best collections of, are kind of 1950s era LeCoultre kind of shaped watches, like these grasshopper lugs and asymmetric cases and everything else. The reality is, like, not enough people know about them. It's like Charlie Dunn, yourself, and me, and just a
Yeah.
few other people that they know about them, the brand as well, but they haven't really promoted them. So if they ever did a collectibles capsule, or if there was ever like a very serious scholarship or video about them, things like that, people would suddenly be hunting them and they'd go up like 3x in a matter of 2 weeks, kind of thing. So that's like a very concrete example of they're really cool. Very few people know about them, which is maybe better for you because you can
Yeah,
still acquire.
exactly.
You're still in acquisition mode, but then when you're ready to sell, you want everyone to know about them and think they're really cool, and for them to be worth 10x what they're worth now.
For me, it's I always wanted something different. Of course, what you want different is complications,
Yeah,
but then some complications go beyond your budget. So imagine if you go to like tourbillons and then minute repeaters, and that goes above 100K for each complication.
yeah,
So. Um, what else could be different in my opinion? Like when I was asking myself, so shapes. And then this is how I came across that those uh, extremely for me very 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 feral or very beautiful watches that are of different shapes, and I guess everybody wants different stuff, and going into their stories and where do they come, why did they do it. Today we talk about tariffs, and we see that some of them, for example, were cased in America just
yes,
because of the
tariffs.
tariffs then.
Yeah,
So those stories, I think, also like those stories is what got me into them, and yeah, I guess the going back to the question about brands and elevating brands and or the heritage of brands. I'm sure a lot of brands come to you to ask you about collectors, and a lot of brands, of course, are pouring money into marketing and a lot of those kind of things, but uh, imagine if they go and talk to collectors of vintage watches, and see what drove them to their heritage. What drove? I'm not saying that brands
no,
don't do it.
yeah,
I'm sure a lot of them do,
they
but at
don't
the
do
same
it
time,
enough. Yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. So what do you think would be that marketing politics that can get them elevated?
I think I see certainly when collectors gather with a brand, there's a lot of renewed enthusiasm. So Tag Heuer, the last couple years, they've done like a gathering of collectors, some journalists and myself, some people like that. We went to the factory I hadn't visited since 2013, and they had let everyone kind of look through the museum, the archives, had a kind of a full couple-day itinerary. Like that inspired people who went there to want to buy more vintage and modern Tag Heuer, honestly, as well. Same when like JLC did their collectibles events. Like it both inspired people who were interested in vintage watches, but also want to pursue new models with them. So it's great. Same with like the Reverso exhibition where we met in New York. Like that was such a well done event, and still yielding fruit over a year later. So that's really nice. I think gathering people together is always a good thing. It doesn't need to be everyone flies over to Switzerland necessarily, but can be in the United States. They do different gatherings. Like I think JLC did an event in Singapore recently with all the Singaporean collectors. So, yeah, sometimes just the local gatherings are just as great as traveling to the mothership in Switzerland.
Yeah, I guess. And so now we talked about commerce, about we talked about scholarship, and mostly about passion of vintage watches. So how does Eric Wind navigate that balance between scholarship, commerce, and the passion of vintage watches?
They're all linked for sure. Obviously, at the end of the day, like no one's sending me a check every month, so I've got to eat what I kill. If I is what I often say, eat what I kill, or that sort of thing. So that obviously is important. You got to have liquidity in the market though too. Like if you have such a rare watch and no one's offering it for sale, then people don't know about it, then prices aren't really established. So I think about that with the 1950s Lecoultres sometimes, because where do you see them for sale basically outside of eBay occasionally? It's not like you really see them on websites. I've had a couple interesting vintage Lecoultre watches, but there's not enough liquidity in the market at this time. Kind of was similar with the crash for a while because everyone who had one didn't want to sell it. So the prices weren't really established. There wasn't enough supply in the market. And then scholarship is really key. Like my goal is always that people buying from us are educated about what they're buying, the history of it, the condition, that sort of thing. The more educated someone is, the better client they can become because they understand what they're buying and it's not like 5,000 questions about the watch. So my goal is always that people are really well educated, whereas I think honestly, most vintage dealers don't want their clients well educated or asking questions. They want you just to say yes and buy whatever you're putting in front of them because they like the look of it. They're not trying to educate. And that I would say is a key differentiator of what we try to do.
And honestly, you do it great. I mean, for myself, whenever I do research about certain watches, you guys are the first that I go and read. I know Charlie wrote about the Memovox, and
Yeah.
I love Memovoxes.
Yeah, that's good.
And now with a podcast that you guys are also doing, that's amazing. So
That's fun. And we've got a book coming out as well next year. So that'll be great. The Modern Guide to Vintage Watches. And we've spent a lot of time on that the last almost 2 years. And it'll be a good resource for people interested in vintage watches as well.
Oh, definitely. Definitely it will be a very good resource or something that is needed.
Yeah.
So, Eric, are there moments where collector culture itself becomes a form of soft power or cultural diplomacy? And I'm going to go into that
Yeah.
more deeper, but
No, I think it is funny just to see how like collector groups can have a big impact. So there's a group called the Vintage Rolex Asylum that was primarily Indonesian collectors, but also in Hong Kong. And when I was at Christie's, they were kind of building up a big collection. There were kind of 32 guys or so that were part of it. And Christie's, we flew over there with watches. Did a kind of Q&A and some events there. Like that wasn't a normal spot for Christie's to send watches from Geneva or Hong Kong and the United States. So that was my first time in Jakarta. Certainly, Hong Kong is huge. So the fact that's like one of the cultural epicenters of watches, where a lot of people go to sell watches, hunt for watches, etc., is good for China, I would say, and for Asia. A lot of people come to the U.S. for different watch events as well, including from Switzerland. So that it's all like all these different overlaps are very interesting. I travel all over the world to see collectors and go to events. I went to Bali as well for a big collector gathering with a lot of those vintage Rolex Asylum guys. So it's you just never know where it's going to take you. It definitely is a form of soft power for these countries.
So I just came from Geneva Watch Days, and I was there with some U.S. collectors, and everybody's talking about the effects that the tariffs will have, and
Yeah,
how collectors can maybe influence. And then, of course, coming here, and the U.S. president went to see the U.S. Open from the.
with Rolex. Yeah.
So I guess these all play into the political effect that collectors or can have as a soft power. Writing or talking about these topics, it always looked to me as I'm too much obsessed about everything being political, of course, as a political scientist. But now I found a counterpart that is.
You have.
As a political junkie. Now, Eric, where do you see the vintage and neo-vintage market heading now and over the next decade? And I'm not going to ask you which is the next big thing, so I can afford them. But
no, I think I'm very optimistic about vintage watch prices and neo-vintage prices for top condition pieces.
yeah,
Primarily, there's just an increased awareness of condition now versus 5 to 10 years ago. Many more people are aware of words like unpolished that no one ever heard before, and reloomed, and understanding like what a watch should look like in original condition. There's now, thankfully, not the requirement that watches look brand new old stock, and have recut cases and polished and everything else. Like, people want honest watches and honest condition. So that's a good thing. I think the values between average and restored, kind of, I should say, exceptional and average, like
yeah.
placing like overly restored watches in that average category, are going to continue to differentiate. So that's good. I think there's always that idea that people like to collect what was popular when they were a kid. So,
Yeah.
neo vintage kind of continually becomes more relevant to people, but I'm still passionate about like 1960s and 1970s Rolex, even though I wasn't alive then. I'm less passionate about like 1990s Rolex, even though I was alive then and can kind of remember some of the ads. But for some people, I hear them reaching out and saying, like, I really want a 90s GMT because I remember when that was like, I was, 10 years old and that was the watch I thought was really cool, or 16 years old or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, I think neo vintage still offers like a tremendous value to modern. Like, I would take a 1990s Pepsi GMT over a brand new Pepsi GMT, even though it's like 50% less expensive or something like that. It's way less expensive. I would rather have the 90s version because the case is thinner and I think it's more interesting as a watch. But yeah, I think overall it's best to just pursue what you know versus, and also what you like, obviously. For me, it's still the much older watches, even though I wasn't alive then.
Same here. Although I may look like that, but I'm not. I was not born in '50s and
I thought you
'60s.
were. No, I'm just kidding. I know, exactly. Exactly. That's good.
So, if watches are political artifacts as much as mechanical ones,
Yeah.
what story do you think vintage collecting is telling today?
I think vintage collectors are really interesting people, and I always say if you're collecting vintage watches, you're more likely like someone I'd want to have a conversation with than someone just wearing a new GMT or new Datejust or even a new Nautilus or whatever. Like, you have something more interesting to say probably about why you like it. You're probably of higher intelligence and higher IQ and higher net worth. I always joke with our podcast listeners, they're the highest net worth listeners of any podcast on the planet by far. Average net worth, it's super high. But,
That's true.
vintage watch collectors are usually at the top of their field, whether it's as in education like yourself or medicine or in finance, banking. Like, these are people that are usually really killing it. They're not like middle managers just getting by. They're usually like doing really, really excellent work, is something I've noticed. I don't know exactly why, but they're clearly high IQ and, interesting people. So, yeah, so I think it does tell a little bit about the people that are collecting. It's fun.
Oh wow, amazing, amazing. And no, these are like these are very, very interesting um, um, answers coming from somebody that is in the industry, is interacting with people who are buying. And you interact a lot with celebrities. So why do celebrities collect? Okay, they are high in IQ. That's true. But what
Sometimes, yes, sometimes no.
so like what is their appeal? Because like for example, I don't know any celebrities, so I wouldn't be able to speak about that. But in your experience, what appeals to them as vintage watch collectors?
I think each person has different things they're looking for, but I know Jay-Z has really gotten interested in vintage watches
Oh yeah.
recently. And really, he likes them because he wants something that no one else has, ultimately. So, and when they're presenting him with a watch, it has to be like unique in some way. It can't just be something you can buy like 50 of on Chrono 24. It's got to be like very, very special. So, that I think is for him, like, anyone can go buy like a 5711 slash 1A kind of Nautilus. So that's like too common for him. He's like was seen wearing a Cubitus very early on and things like that. He probably wouldn't wear it now because so many people have them, but like he wore it just because it was something no one else had at the time. Same with like the Tiffany blue Nautilus, but he was kind of doing Tiffany and Co stuff with his wife, Beyonce. Like I doubt we'll ever see him wear that watch again because now it feels like kind of common. Yeah, I think a lot of celebrities it's like storytelling. They like the look of it. They're into the aesthetics of the watch, but they also want something no one else has. And they were trying to be cool at the end of the day. And I heard a great quote. There's a new documentary about the downfall of Vice called Vice is Broke. They went from a $5.7 billion valuation to going through bankruptcy in a very short order. But a commentator said, cool is not a renewable resource. Like, you either kind of have it or you don't. And I think for a lot of celebrities, they're always trying to stay like a bit cool and something that's interesting no one else has.
But before I let you go, I want to ask you, what is a collector in your opinion? Not only a vintage watch collector, but
Yeah.
what is a watch collector or a collector in general?
Yeah, we spent actually a lot of time about this when we were writing our book, The Modern Guide to Vintage Watches, but defining what a collector is. For me, the single biggest hallmark is a collector who's someone who's willing to share. So that means sharing information and knowledge first off, to help others. There's a lot of people who are so selfish, like they don't want to share anything and they just want to hoard it all to themselves. Like, I don't think that's a collector, that's a hoarder.
Yep.
But also to even share their watches with other people so they can see them, or whatever object they're collecting, whether it's sharing it at an event or with people privately or in an exhibition or whatever. I think you've got to be willing to share what you have and your knowledge with others. I think of like the Ronald Lauder, like he set up a museum in New York. He bought The Woman in Gold by Klimt and things like that, but he wanted to share what he had. A lot of art collectors, they're great when they actually want to share what they have in exhibitions and things like that. It's a positive thing. Same with car collectors, like the car museums or like car gatherings, like the Cavallino Classic in Palm Beach. It's like a great event where people bring their cars and people can look at them. Sometimes they let you even like sit inside the car, like my son Charlie when we went. People are letting him get in their multi-million-dollar Ferraris and things like that, just so you can see it. And like, it's about sharing what you have.
Well, that's definitely an interesting take. For me, it was always because there's this question always on my mind, like, what is a correct collector and
Yeah.
what is a hoarder?
Yeah.
Because when you have a lot of watches, you're asking yourself, hey, am I a hoarder, or am I
You're a hoarder.
curating something?
I'm
a hoarder.
You're a JLC hoarder.
But the thing is that according to your definition, I'm sharing it. I share it around. I bring them in events. Remember, both of when we met for the first time, you had a memo box, I had a memo box.
Yeah,
so
it's so fun. And you're sharing your collection on social media as well. I was freaking out always with seeing what you had and posting it. So you're not doing it clearly to impress anyone, because it's like 5 people in the world are impressed, including the JLC staff. But you're sharing it because it's like your passion, which is awesome.
And also, for me, it's also about knowledge, about educating that part, which you also said.
Yeah.
Eric, you are a true collector. In any definition, thank you very much for sharing all that knowledge, that wisdom that you have gathered, that you have collected for such a long time with us here. And I promise that I promise to the audience that Watches and Politics is not about current politics. Otherwise, we could speak maybe later. But otherwise, we would never stop talking with you. We cannot stop talking about the vintage watches and politics, let alone current politics.
Yeah, exactly.
It was such a nice conversation. Thank you very much for being here, and for sharing your knowledge and for doing what you do.
Hoya Saxa.
Hoya Saxa. Thank you very much.
Thank you.